Well, good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to greet you here today, this morning. I'm going to talk to you today about, well, I'm going to tell you a few stories, and that probably doesn't come as a surprise for you, being here at a storytelling conference. The stories I'm about to tell you are not fiction, they're true life stories that shaped me as a person and as a teacher. I'm also going to share a few lessons that I learned being an educator through teaching different students in different settings, using different approaches. So my story started quite predictably. I was going to be an educator and I knew about it when I was a child. I was born to a family of educators. In fact, I was the fourth generation of educators in my family. My grandfather was a professor of linguistics, author of several books in Russian language, and so was my mother, who held a PhD in linguistics and was a department chair at a university for over 30 years. So there was no question about my career choice, really. Things were pretty much lined up, and I was going to be an educator. I got my teaching degree at one of the most prestigious schools in the Soviet Union and graduated with honors, and I was ready to storm linguistic world armed with strong knowledge of how the language works. At that time, we lived in the capital of Moldova. It's one of the Soviet Union republics. And they had a number of diplomatic foreign offices who happened to be hiring a Russian teacher. So I nailed my interviews and got a job at the International Monetary Fund and United Nations, where I was about to teach Russian to American diplomats. You know, those guys who speak like 18 languages and just need another one for their current assignment. Perfect job for a language teacher. And I was totally prepared. I got my textbooks, I printed out my syllabus, put posters with vocabulary lists, but my biggest pride were conjugation charts. Color-coded. I put them together myself. Boy, did they have all the endings. Dozens and dozens of those. Masculine, feminine, neuter, hard stem ending, soft stem ending, you name them, and all the exceptions, of course. Those geniuses were about to learn Russian. So I started out with prepositional case. And here are the charts. I announced proudly after an overview of Russian case preamble. You know, my diplomat students had impeccable manners. They did their best to stay interested and to stay awake. But 20 minutes into my passionate explanation, one by one, their faces started to turn into screensavers. By the time I had my last class, none of us was excited about Russian. I don't know how much they learned during that course, but I surely learned my first valuable lesson as an educator. Learning should not be painful. Years later, when I started to teach French and Russian in the United States, using storytelling approach, my students had totally different response. But don't take my word for it. Hear it for yourself. I reached out to some of my former students, and this is what they had to say.
That was always super fun, and it just made me feel like I could just keep taking this class forever, and I'll just keep learning more and more.
With this, it's like you're in it, you're speaking it, even in phrases, you get excited, you're like, oh my gosh, look at me, I'm talking French. You know?
Language, it's less like you're taking a class and more like you're speaking with people So that's inherently more interesting than studying. But we still learned the language just by being in the class.
So, back to my story. As I said, at that time, we lived in the Republic of Moldova. And life was pretty much stable. Until one day, the war started, between Moldovans and Russians, and we lost our jobs, some friends, our neighbors stopped talking to us, and we saw slogans, Russians get out, and it all seemed unreal. So I had to flee the country being 8 months pregnant with that guy sitting right there, to have my first child born at a refugee camp in Netherlands, where I met so many people from different countries, from all over the world. There were Croatians, Bosnians, Afghans, Iraqis, and many others. And we all lived there as one family. We all shared food, shelter, conversations. We had different ways of handling everyday mundane routine, like eating with fingers or with utensils, observing or ignoring personal space, greeting each other, and we all came with certain biases, which were quickly dissipating as we learned more about each other. At first, I had my reservations living in the same, under the same roof with Afghans, because after all, for 10 years of my life, my country was at war with Afghanistan, and I grew up surrounded by veterans of Afghan war and their stories. But the more I learned about those people, the more we lived together, the more I realized how hospitable, giving, fun, family-oriented they were. And there I was sitting in the circle on the floor, eating rice with my fingers, and realizing that all my prejudice and reservations about those people were gone. And it was there, in the refugee camp, where I learned my second lesson.
Oops, you go back.
Learn the culture, accept the people. We're raising our children in a much smaller world than we grew up in. Technology has erased geographical barriers to communication. Our students are bound to live and work with people of different cultures, with different backgrounds. And it falls on us as language teachers to spark their cultural curiosity, to cultivate that cultural sensitivity and help them become world citizens. And a little more from my former students.
Your job.
So in my job, I actually work at a hotel, and for a time I worked at the front desk of the hotel, and we have guests that come from all over the world. And multiple times, and continuously, I'm able to use French to help those guests get into the room, check in, answer questions about the local area, things that are around us, where they can go, let's say, to do laundry or to buy groceries, or even the hospital. I've been able to help guests in emergency situations. So it's been very useful to be able to, and helpful, to be able to speak to them in French. I'm properly, I'm the French speaker.
Family. We get so many patients and families where I work that come in that speak primarily Spanish, but also Italian and French, and how much we wish that we would be able to serve all of these patients and families better by knowing the languages.
My girlfriend's Indonesian. Her mom speaks Indonesian to her and her siblings. So I wanted to learn Indonesian. And I remembered the great experiences I had learning French, and I went directly to the TPRS website and was looking for an Indonesian book, but I couldn't find any.
My family's part Mexican. My sister just graduated, so she was really looking forward to being able to speak the language and talk to her cousins and her aunts from it. She took 5 years. She can't hold a conversation.
I went to Mexico last summer, and none of the Americans really could speak Spanish. But all of the Mexican people could speak both English and Spanish. And I just felt really embarrassed that I was in their country and they knew how to speak my language, but I didn't know how to speak theirs.
Well, so we moved to the United States. And unlike my husband, I was totally equipped to live in this country. With my proper English, I was going to get a job in no time. Now, my husband was a different story. His English was atrocious. I'm sorry, honey, I didn't know you were coming. He gave no respect to grammar rules, articles, tenses, let alone complex sentences with subordinate clauses that I used with ease. I was preparing to become the sole breadwinner. I can't say I was happy about it, but I was ready for that. Surprisingly, things didn't go the way I thought they would. You know, while I was editing every sentence that I said to make sure that I was using the proper grammar, he was laughing with our neighbors, making jokes with his Russian accent, and it wasn't long until he got his first professional job. Now, with his subpar English, his career, his professional career, skyrocketed, and he's now an executive director in Silicon Valley. The irony is, his English, although greatly improved, is not flawless. If you don't believe me, go talk to him. And when he writes emails to the CEOs of the biggest companies of the world, he has no clue what grammatical structure he's using. He just uses the one that sounds right. Great? Ladies and gentlemen, this is when I humbly admit to my lesson number 3. Fluency does not rest on grammar knowledge. Interesting fact, years later, when I became a certified OPI tester, I learned that official term, government term for advanced level is storyteller. Now let's see what my students have to say on grammar.
Well, they taught us Italian for 3 years straight of just conjugations and lists of conjugations, and I don't remember any of it.
I speak Spanish, but I do not conjugate.
In college, I took Italian. It was part of my requirement as an opera performance major, and it was entirely grammar focused. I did not retain much of anything at all.
That and see that I could understand the way that the dialogue was going and how sentences were putting together, rather than having memorized the grammar rules.
I mean, tons of people go through high school and they come out and they just say, "Oh yeah, I took Spanish. That was funny that I got through it," and not really enjoyed it at all, and just saw it as a joke of not really learning anything.
So, my language teaching career in the United States started in New York, where I received my certifications and started to teach French and Russian in middle and high schools. I was given a set of old textbooks, and once again I found myself trudging the same road paved with grammar rules, monotonous exercises, declensions, conjugations. My enrollment dropped. My students weren't making much of a progress. I felt really disheartened, and I must have looked so pitiful that merciful language gods sent me Susie Gross with her 3-day workshop. So glad you're here, Susie. Now, those of us who attended Susie's workshop, you know how it goes. You catch the NTPRS bug, and that soon develops into chronic disease. There's no way back. I wanted to do what she was doing. I signed up for all all her workshops in the area. When I showed up at her third workshop, Susie, you must have thought I'm stalking you. Susie looked at me and she goes, Katya, this is the same workshop you just attended twice. You're not going to learn anything new today. Why don't you go and see Blaine Ray, my dear? And so I did. And I did sign up for a Spanish week-long class with Blaine, followed up with national conference in Vegas. Blaine, I'll never forget how you spotted me, in that big crowd. And you said, oh, la chica rusa. You just attended my Spanish class. Why don't you teach us 3 structures in Russian? Nobody here speaks Russian. He cared not that it was my first conference, first day of it. And it didn't faze him that there were 300+ people in the audience. By the way, that doesn't sound like Blaine at all, right? He would never do anything like this. Anyways, I don't think I ever sweated as much as I did during that presentation. But this is when I grew my NTPRS wings. I returned to my classroom and jumped right in. I was probably doing everything wrong. Forget about steps, circling, slowing down. I broke so many rules. Yet, my students were making so much of a progress. My enrollment grew, and most importantly, we were having so much fun. And I was vigorously attending, TPRS workshops, learning the art of the storytelling. And as I was becoming a better teacher, my students were becoming more fluent in Russian and French. We were all in the same boat. We were all learning. And that realization brought us closer. And this is when I learned my next lesson. We're all learners. We're just at different stages of this journey. Soon, we moved to Connecticut, and I started to teach at an inner city school. At that time, they only had Spanish program there, so I had to start French program from zero. How much better does it get? My Spanish colleagues, old-timers, they just got a set of realidades for all their classes. And when I stepped into my new classroom, I saw piles of Bon Voyage textbooks waiting for me. I really wanted to shout off the rooftop about TPRS, but I didn't. Instead of that, I started to write stories aligned with each lesson in the textbook. We were creating story after story with our students, and it wasn't long before we invited our principal to our French class. 5 minutes into the lesson, the principal was the main character in the story. Oh, poor guy, I didn't give him heads up. He was eating spicy wings with Pamela Anderson at Hooters. Students were merciless. It was time for that principal to pay for all detentions, dress code, reinforcements. And it was a home run story. We really hit the sweet spot. The budget for TPRS materials was approved. And for the next 4 years, I taught exclusively using TPRS materials at that school. The testimonials you're watching today are from students of that inner city school. Oh. And almost 10 years later, this is what they had to say.
When I graduated from high school, I went to college. Well, I went to college, and at college I wanted to take French, but they wouldn't let me take French. They said that my French was too advanced. We used the books of Blaine Ray. They were really easy to read. When my kids go to school, I would like for them to learn a language through storytelling and hopefully through the Blaine Ray books, because those are the books and the methods that work.
I went to France with my grandma, no tour guide, no group, just me and her. I got by the entire week with my French. I ordered, I got directions, I was able to have conversations with people, able to help with the taxi, everything. You know what I mean? I was able to go to France and talk and get by and just enjoy it.
But there was a little boy who was lost in Maine who could not find his parents, and he only spoke French, and none of the lifeguards were able to help him find his family because they weren't able to speak French. But I was able to understand that he was on the other side of the beach and the color of the umbrella, you know, that his parents were at, and I was able to bring him to find his family.
When we went to France last summer, that was about almost 9 years after I had graduated from high school, and I was still able to remember basic French phrases, and was able to communicate with people.
And that brings me to the next lesson I learned. You don't need everyone to like it, you just need one. So, oops. Next, life took me to California, where I started to teach at the Defense Language Institute. Well, implementing storytelling into that curriculum presented the biggest challenge of my career yet. You can imagine how rigid is the environment at the Military Language Institute. Like, utterly impossible to inject fun, impromptu stories into the rigid, highly structured, curriculum. Fast forwarded 7 years later, our Russian school has, stories on shared folders for every lesson. Our French and Spanish schools are using NTPRS novellas, and our Arabic school is looking for NTPRS novellas. Susie, you were the one who made me go and take that job. I really didn't want to. I am now a department chair of a big Russian, department and a Soviet Croatian department as well. And we're using storytelling, word spread, and I was asked to present in different schools in storytelling, in different, our institute has lots of different language schools. I could not film my TLI students, we're not allowed to film them. And we're not allowed to let anybody into our classes. But I was able to get quotes from them on the storytelling. And therefore, here are the quotes from my students. guys love storytelling, you know, and even when we have very high level of language in the classroom, we still do, you know, elements of storytelling all the time, and they really enjoy them. And that brings me to my next lesson. Just because it hasn't been done before, it doesn't mean it cannot be done.
That's right.
And while I was changing linguistic world, you know, busy here, in my own backyard, my own children were suffering through their language classes. They can attest to that. My oldest son took 4 years of French, right? Knew all conjugations, all endings, right? All endings. Could conjugate any verb, could not understand simple conversation. He graduated college as a valedictorian. He signed up for the most challenging calculus, advanced calculus classes, yet he was so afraid of signing up for language classes. In fact, he didn't sign up for any language classes, you know. And to the left of the valedictorian, we have a law school student, you know, an avid reader and a gifted writer. Dropped out of French the moment he could. Am I right? Yep. 2 more here in the high school can't wait to be done with their language classes because they're, you know, mandatory for graduation. And this trend should not continue. We're not taking our kids to the desired destination, proficiency. We have to change direction. As an administrator, I have to conduct dozens and dozens of lessons observations. And when I come to class, I try to find a spot where I can see my students' faces. And I see those faces light up when the story is coming up, when there is an interesting storyline or favorite character, when the students are going to be talked about. So, you know, as you go this week through this conference, I wish you well on the journey as you grow your own TPRS wings. Consider trying something new this year. You know, make your students' faces light up as they become the center of the story. Pair them up with Kim Kardashian, Kanye West, you know, LeBron James, and just, you know, watch them enjoying it. And it will be soon, they'll be gone soon, you know, from school, and you will be teaching your next generation of language learners. And at that time, they will be ordering foie gras in Paris or asking for directions in Mexico City. And this is the best gift you can give to them. Let's teach proficiency. The stakes are high.
Let's get it started. Let's get it started in here. Let's get it started. Let's get it started in here. Let's get it started. Let's get it started in here. Let's get it started. Let's